building.
This is right, Arab.
Hello and welcome to WION Live, broadcast from Cornwall. I'm Olly Barratt and today is the final day of the G7 summit here in the UK. Climate and economy are key issues of the final plenary sessions, and the group of 7 leaders have been taking important decisions about the planet. This and much more lined up ahead. First, let's take a look at the headlines this hour. A focus on tackling climate change as G7 leaders meet on the third and final day of the summit. British naturalist and broadcaster David Attenborough has addressed G7 leaders here in Cornwall. UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab says Britain wants to ease tensions with the EU, but says the bloc must remember not to undermine Northern Ireland's position as a part of the United Kingdom. After the G7 nations here moved to counter China's growing influence, Beijing has hit back at the world's richest democracies, saying global decisions are not dictated by a small group of countries.
Again, you've got hospitalisations up, you've got cases up. There are grounds for caution. That doesn't mean that.
In view of the rise in the Delta variant of COVID-19 in the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson hints that the scheduled reopening for June the 21st might be delayed. The final announcement will be made tomorrow. Israel is set for a crucial vote in Parliament on whether to install a coalition government that could end Benjamin Netanyahu's 12 years in power. This as thousands demonstrate against Netanyahu outside his residence in Jerusalem. Seven of Iran's presidential candidates hold their final televised national debate ahead of the June the 18th election. The focus of the debate was Iran's nuclear deal, and it coincided with talks being held in Vienna. The climate crisis has been one of the main themes at this year's G7 summit. The UK hopes leaders will make significant environmental commitments as the summit wraps up. British naturalist and broadcaster Sir David Attenborough has addressed the final day of the summit. Meanwhile, 7 environmental groups continued to protest here in Cornwall, the venue for the summit.
Scientists have made it clear that greenhouse gas emissions must be halved by 2030 if the world is to stay within the 1.5 degrees of global heating. The group of 7 leaders who are yet to formally adopt the pledges to curb carbon emissions have been blasted by environmental campaigners, highlighting the lack of climate change action from the world leaders. Ocean rebellion activists staged a protest in the harbour of the coastal city of Falmouth. Campaigners have accused the G7 governments of spending money on conferences and summits, but not doing enough to protect the environment and in particular the oceans. Campaigning against the use of fossil fuels, members and supporters of the global environment movement Extinction Rebellion walked through the town of Falmouth, playing drums and chanting slogans outside the G7 Media Centre.
So we're sounding the alarm and we're calling out greenwashing today about the leaders of the G7. They have been drowning us in promises and not delivering. So we're here to say to them, it's time to actually take action.
Environmental group called Surfers Against Sewage protested at the Gillen Base beach in Falmouth. 12 ocean activists floated on boards holding a banner to put ocean health at the heart of the ongoing summit. Activists from charity group Oxfam have called on the group of 7 industrialized nations to step up their actions to fight climate change. The protesters further brought out a message in a bottle to launch an SOS call for climate. At least 500 people joined the parade in St. Ives, playing drums and chanting, "Act now and sound the alarm." The message could not be clearer. The current targets under the Paris Agreement are not sufficient, and leading world powers will now have to take a giant leap towards sustainable energy. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
And for more on the climate issue, I'm going to bring in my colleague Benji Hire now, who is across that story. Benji joining me live here in Cornwall. And Benji, a key focus has been coal.
Yeah, the strict measures hoping to be introduced on coal. What does that mean in practice exactly? Well, they want to try and force a move away from coal plants unless they have the technology to adopt carbon capture. That is the process of taking the CO2 from production, trying to move it back to its original source, and then essentially store it underground, preventing those emissions from escaping into the environment. The G7 countries also want to make sure that that's being done elsewhere in the world. That's easier said than done. A lot of countries make a lot of money from that industry, and so there's going to be incentives introduced to try to make sure that those countries have enough money to move away from coal, and billions of dollars are being promised to those poorer nations to try and force that change.
And the UK is also hosting COP26 in November in Glasgow. Is a lot of this about looking ahead to that event and upping those ambitions?
Absolutely. I mean, this is obviously coming amid increasing talk of climate and protests here as well. We'll come to talk about that in a moment. But as you say, there is that look ahead towards that climate summit, and more pledges being made in light of that and looking ahead to that in terms of emissions. The White House saying that this is officially the first time that all these richer nations have actually agreed to that 1.5 degrees Celsius rise. And that's an important figure to talk about here, because if you cast your mind back a few years to the Paris Agreement, it was there that environmentalists claimed that you can't have a rise of more than 2 degrees Celsius, otherwise there'll be irreversible damage to the planet. And so real importance on trying to make sure that emissions are kept low, and promises can be put in place with that COP26 in mind too.
I saw you yesterday swimming in the sea off Cornwall here. As protests were taking place, there was a paddle out off one of the Cornish beaches. What were those protesters saying? What do they want?
That's right. It's no surprise that activists have been trying to make their voice heard on this issue, given that climate has been such a central theme of the summit. In fact, it's the first net zero G7 gathering. The protesters essentially calling for faster action quicker. Now, they might be encouraged by the progress being made today, but that's not to say that they weren't still making their voice heard, as I say. People paddling out, literally out to sea, trying to turn the tide on climate change. And they weren't the only ones. There were kind of media and police bemused by images of Pikachu, that Japanese Pokemon character, again campaigning against Japanese coal mining, and a number of other protests around. Greenpeace out and about trying to kind of cause a stir as Joe Biden landed. They should be encouraged, as I say, by the promises made, but they are calling for quicker action, and they will be trying to, of course, heed the words of David Attenborough, the naturalist and broadcaster who's just addressed the leaders at the G7, and he has some very stern warnings. He's come out and said that actually that we are on the verge of destabilising the entire planet, and this is an essential pivotal moment for G7 leaders. So the campaigners will be listening hard to that, and of course that will be on the minds of the leaders too as they bring the summit to a close.
OK, Benji, thank you. My colleague Benji Hire joining me here live in Cornwall. In a coordinated response to Beijing's growing assertiveness, the Group of 7 richest democracies have put in place a massive infrastructure plan for developing nations. This is designed to counter China's multi-trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative. That's also a global infrastructure plan. The G7 version is called Build Back Better World Plan. It's a US-led initiative which will help close a $40 trillion infrastructure gap in needy countries. However, China has hit back. In a strongly worded statement, Beijing says, and I quote, "The days when global decisions were dictated by a small group of countries are long gone." But the world's richest democracies are attempting to find a more unified position over Beijing.
Wrapped up the second day of their summit on Saturday with an extended family photo that included the leaders of South Africa, South Korea, and Australia. Saturday's working session focused on efforts to counter China's growing influence, with G7 leaders offering developing nations an infrastructure plan that could rival President Xi Jinping's multi-trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative. The White House said U.S. President Joe Biden and other G7 leaders hope their global infrastructure plan, known as the Build Back Better World Initiative, will help close a $40 trillion infrastructure gap in needy countries. China's Belt and Road Initiative involves development and investment initiatives that would stretch from Asia to Europe and beyond. More than 100 countries have already signed on to cooperate with China in projects like railways and other infrastructure. Meanwhile, on the subject of human rights abuses, Biden made, quote, forceful comments to G7 leaders about the need to make a strong statement on what Washington and rights groups say is the use of forced labor in China. According to a U.S. official, there was a, quote, spectrum of how far different countries are willing to go in their criticism in a final communique from the three-day summit. Though the official later said that the G7 leaders have reached consensus on the need for a shared approach to China selling exports at unfairly low prices and to human rights abuses. UN experts and rights groups estimate over 1 million people, mainly Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities, have been detained in China in recent years. Beijing denies all accusations of forced labor or abuse.
And while China was one focus on day 2 of the summit, the COVID-19 pandemic also formed a large part of the discussions here. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi participated virtually in the G7 Outreach Summit, to which India has been invited along with South Africa, South Korea and Australia.
Minister Narendra Modi is participating at the G7 summit for the second time since France invited India for the summit in 2019. On the second day of the summit, the Indian Prime Minister spoke at the session named Building Back Stronger Health. During the session, which focused on global recovery from the COVID pandemic, Prime Minister Modi urged the G7 states to adopt a united approach to the coronavirus pandemic and future health emergencies with the mantra of One Earth, One Health. The Indian Prime Minister thanked G7 and other countries present at the meet for supporting India amid the second wave of the COVID crisis. As India is seeking support on COVID vaccine patent waiver, the Indian Prime Minister asked G7 countries to support India and South Africa's proposal for COVID vaccine patent waiver at the World Trade Organization. As pointed out by Prime Minister Modi, this proposal was part of collective endeavors to improve global health governance, toward which India remains committed. As variants of the coronavirus continue to emerge, countries are racing to vaccinate their populations as fast as possible. German Chancellor Angela Merkel conveyed her strong support by specifically referring to Prime Minister Modi's One Earth, One Health mantra at the meet. During the summit, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison recalled his discussions with Prime Minister Modi about COVID vaccine patent waiver and conveyed his country's strong support. French President Emmanuel Macron has backed India's stance on vaccine patent waivers. Backing the proposal, Macron said that France will propose for the nations to work on exemptions for intellectual property rights and that patents must not create obstacles in boosting production of vaccines. WTO was able to achieve consensus on the proposal last week, with India calling for early conclusion of negotiations. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
At the end of day 2 of this G7 summit, leaders were treated to a Red Arrows flypast, the British Royal Air Force planes performing over the site of the summit in Cornwall. After meeting his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin next week in Geneva, US President Joe Biden will hold a solo news conference. The White House says this is the best approach to avoid any public display of tensions.
There will not be a joint news conference after U.S. President Joe Biden meets with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, in Geneva next week. Instead, Biden will speak to the media alone. A White House official on Saturday said a solo press conference is the appropriate format. It will spare Biden from open jousting with Putin after what is certain to be a combative encounter. And a solo news conference will deny Putin an elevated international platform to castigate the West and sow discord. In 2018, a joint news conference with Putin and then President Donald Trump led to shock when Trump cast doubt on the findings of his own intelligence agencies and flattered the Russian leader.
President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
The Biden-Putin summit, set for June 16th, will cover strategic nuclear stability, and according to the White House, Biden will bring up ransomware attacks, Moscow's aggression against Ukraine, the jailing of dissidents, and other issues that have irritated the relationship. Ahead of the meeting, in an interview with NBC News, Putin said that relations with the U.S. were at their lowest point in years.
We want a stable, predictable relationship.
Biden on Wednesday said the U.S. is not seeking conflict with Russia, but
the United States will respond in a robust and meaningful way when the Russian government engages in harmful activities.
Russia says the West is gripped by anti-Russian hysteria and that it will defend its interests in any way it sees fit.
Amid rising concern over the spread of the Delta variant in this country, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he might delay the final lifting of coronavirus lockdown restrictions in England. The Delta variant, which was first identified in India, has caused a surge in COVID cases in Britain, throwing into doubt the government plan to ease the final set of restrictions on June the 21st. Speaking at the sidelines of the G7 Leaders Summit here in Cornwall, Johnson said the virus spread was a matter of serious concern and said authorities need to be cautious to contain the transmission.
We'll be setting out the position on Monday, but of course you're right that you've got to be cautious in order to deliver what we want to see, which is an irreversible roadmap. But we're looking at the data today. That, again, you've got hospitalizations up, you've got cases up. There are grounds for caution. That doesn't mean that this country hasn't made enormous progress with vaccination. Clearly, what you've got is a race between the vaccines and the virus, and the vaccines are going to win. It's just a question of the pace.
According to reports, cabinet ministers are considering holding the June 21st plans for up to 4 weeks as they race to ramp up vaccination among younger age groups. A final decision is expected to be taken later today, ahead of a formal announcement by the Prime Minister on Monday. Britain on Saturday reported 7,738 new COVID-19 cases, slightly down from Friday's figure of over 8,000 cases. The Delta variant is currently accounting for nearly 96% of new cases in England. Meanwhile, Britain's total COVID-19 death count is over 128,000. But the number of daily deaths has fallen following a third nationwide lockdown and a rapid vaccine rollout across the country. Let's move into space now, and the ongoing space race is heating up. Let's take a look at this report.
A rover is about $1 billion.
The steady stream of data Edwin Kite reviews from U.S. and Chinese rovers simultaneously exploring the surface of Mars keeps him busy at his University of Chicago laboratory.
You can quickly go through a loop of making a discovery, forming a hypothesis based on that discovery, and sending a new spacecraft out to test it.
Gathering information in Kite's field of study had traditionally been accomplished using telescopes and analyzing meteors and the few moon rocks U.S. astronauts brought to Earth in the 1960s and 70s. But the new Mars missions are helping Kite and his colleagues obtain a more direct and complete understanding of Mars, thanks to the information the craft and rovers from the different countries have collected throughout the Red Planet.
We're at a really early stage of Mars exploration. We've only scratched the surface of what there is to discover. We don't know which country's investigation is going to stumble over something that unlocks the next stage of exploration.
During a U.S. House of Representatives appropriations hearing that was conducted remotely, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson, a former astronaut and former U.S. Senator from Florida, signaled alarm at the recent success of the Chinese space program, which he says isn't confined to the Red Planet.
They want to send 3 big landers to the South Pole of the moon, and that's where the water is. And we are still a year or two away from a much smaller lander going there.
Which is why Nelson is urging lawmakers to support NASA's Artemis program, which plans to return humans, including the first woman, to the moon, with Mars as an eventual destination. Nelson says China is on a similar path.
I think that's now adding a new element as to whether or not we want to get serious and get a lot of activity going in landing humans back on surface of the moon.
China is gaining rapidly on the U.S., and the Europeans are also in this space race.
Rocky Cobb, a professor of astronomy and astrophysics at the University of Chicago, believes a new space race could be positive. Cobb would like to see the U.S. and Chinese space programs collaborate rather than compete.
There's a lot of talent in China that we could make use of, and a lot of resources in China, and they have money to explore space.
But both Kite and Cobb acknowledge there is a limit to how much cooperation can realistically occur between the United States and China.
So the technology involved in peaceful exploration of space can also be transported to military uses.
There are legal barriers to bilateral cooperation between NASA and the Chinese space program, but those don't apply to non-NASA funded work by academic institutions.
Which is why Kite and Cobb and the scientific community they represent worldwide continue to pore over the tantalizing clues relayed from Mars in an effort to understand the origins of our own planet and species they say isn't confined to national borders.
There is only one Mars. It doesn't belong to the U.S. It doesn't belong to China.
Kane Fairbaugh, VOA News, Chicago, Illinois.
That's all we have time for on this WION live broadcast from Cornwall, where the G7 summit here is into its final hours. I'm Olly Barratt. Stay tuned to WION. World is One.
This is right, Arab.